The clock on the mahogany-paneled wall of the private dining room read 4:17 a.m. Outside the plate-glass window of the Gilded Steer, one of Chicago's most venerable steakhouses, a relentless, freezing rain swept across the deserted streets of the Loop. Inside, the air was thick with the ghosts of cigar smoke and the funereal scent of defeat. Silas Blackwood, the 79-year-old patriarch of Blackwood Industries, a titan who had forged an empire from a single machine shop in Gary, Indiana, stared at the document before him. His hand, gnarled with age and arthritis, but still powerful enough to have once shaped steel, trembled as it held a vintage Mont Blanc pen. The document was a surrender, a 50-page masterpiece of legal jargon that would dissolve his life's work, selling it for pennies on the dollar to a faceless private equity firm. Chapter 11. The words felt like an epitaph. Across the table, his grandnephew, Julian Croft, smiled. It was not a kind smile. It was the patient, triumphant smirk of a jackal that had finally run an old lion to ground. They believed they were alone, save for the lawyers who sat like stone gargoyles, billing $2,000 an hour to witness a corporate execution. They believed the young waitress, hovering by the service door, was just part of the furniture. A silent, exhausted wraith refilling water glasses that no one was drinking. They were wrong. She wasn't just refilling glasses. She was looking at the reflection of the document in the polished silver water pitcher. And she wasn't just seeing words. She was seeing history. She saw the one thing a team of high-priced lawyers had missed, the anachronism, the fatal flaw hidden not in the fine print, but in the very paper it was printed on. The silence in the room was a physical weight. It wasn't the quiet of peace, but the dead calm in the eye of a hurricane. The only sounds were the hiss of the rain against the window and the faint, rhythmic clinking of a carafe against a glass. Silas Blackwood felt a crushing pressure in his chest. His suit, a custom-tailored Brioni that had once felt like armor, now hung on his stooped frame like a shroud. The dark circles under his eyes were trenches, dug by 72 hours of sleepless dread. He stared at the signature line. It was the end of a dynasty that had survived the Great Depression, 2 world wars, and the brutal deindustrialization of the Rust Belt. Blackwood Industries wasn't just a company. It was a promise he had made to his father. A promise to build something that would last. Something real. "It's time, Uncle Silas," Julian said, his voice a smooth, condescending purr. At 38, Julian was the epitome of modern finance. Sharp suit, sharper haircut, and a soul made of spreadsheets. He checked his watch, a rose-gold Audemars Piguet. The consortium in Zurich needs the signed agreement wired by 5 a.m. Chicago time. If we miss the window, the banks seize everything. The liquidation becomes hostile. This way. This way. You get to keep the lake house. You retire with a semblance of dignity. Dignity! Silas's voice was a dry rasp, the sound of rust scraping against stone. You call this dignity, Julian? Forcing me to sell the company my grandfather founded to a shell corporation called Ethelred Holdings? Ethelred Holdings is a highly respected player in asset management, Silas, Julian said, sliding a glass of untouched Macallan 25 towards the old man. They specialize in legacy brands. They're going to streamline operations, make it lean, competitive for the 21st century. You're tired. I've been telling you for years. You're still running this place like it's 1985. You're drowning in nostalgia. Silas looked at the faces around the table. 2 lawyers from the prestigious firm of Latham & Watkins. Their expressions were professionally blank, their eyes as cold and empty as a winter sky over Lake Michigan. They were here to ensure the paperwork was clean, the blood washed away before the markets opened. "I built this," Silas murmured, the pen feeling impossibly heavy. "I built it with my own hands. I remember the smell of the first factory floor, the heat from the furnaces. I survived the '08 crisis when vultures like you were dancing on the graves of better men. And now I'm being brought down by a bad quarter and some leveraged debt I never should have approved." "It was more than a bad quarter, Uncle," Julian said, his tone feigning sympathy. "The pension fund shortfall, the failed expansion in Mexico, the derivative contracts that went south. It was a perfect storm. We've been over this. The creditors are invoking the acceleration clause. This is the only way out that doesn't end with you being personally wiped out." It had all happened so fast. 6 months ago, they were celebrating a record year. Then, a series of misfortunes that felt too precise, too targeted. A sudden regulatory fine, a key supplier going bankrupt, a trusted CFO's unexpected retirement. It was like watching a master demolitionist place charges on the key support pillars of his life's work. "Just sign on page 50, Silas," Julian urged, his voice dropping to a near-hypnotic whisper. "Then it's all over. You can go up to Lake Geneva. You can finally rest." Silas uncapped the pen. The nib hovered, a black teardrop, over the line that would sever his past from his future. "Excuse me." The voice was quiet, almost timid, but it cut through the suffocating tension like a shard of glass. Julian visibly flinched, his mask of calm cracking for a fraction of a second. He swiveled his head, his eyes narrowing with reptilian annoyance. Standing by the credenza was the night shift waitress. Her name tag read, Amelia. She looked to be in her mid-20s, with intelligent, weary eyes that seemed too old for her face. Her uniform was immaculate, but frayed at the cuffs. Her light brown hair was pulled back in a simple, severe knot. In this room of predators and power brokers, she seemed as out of place as a field mouse in a viper pit. "We don't need anything," Julian snapped, his voice laced with venom. "Leave, now." "Mr. Blackwood asked for a fresh pot of coffee an hour ago," Amelia said. Her voice was steady, betraying no fear. She didn't look at Julian. Her gaze was fixed on Silas, and in her eyes he saw not pity, but a flicker of something else. A sharp, focused intensity. "Black, no sugar. The way you always take it, sir." Silas looked up, his clouded mind struggling to focus. He recognized her. She was always the one working the late shift during his marathon board dinners. A quiet, efficient presence. He never knew her name was Amelia. He didn't know she was a doctoral dropout from the University of Chicago's paleography program. He didn't know she could identify the origin of a medieval manuscript by the smell of its parchment. And he certainly didn't know that she was paying off her late father's catastrophic medical debts by working 60 hours a week at a job that was slowly crushing her soul. "Thank you, my dear," Silas said softly. I had forgotten." "Just leave the pot and get out," Julian hissed. "This is a privileged and confidential proceeding." Amelia nodded, placing the heavy silver tray on a nearby sideboard. She moved with a quiet grace, pouring a cup for Silas. But as the dark, steaming liquid filled the porcelain, her eyes were not on the cup. They were locked on the document spread before Silas, catching its reflection in the polished curve of the coffee pot. She saw the heavy, cream-colored paper, the specific watermark visible under the room's dim lighting. Her hand, for a single, imperceptible moment, stopped pouring. She saw the seal, a small, embossed crest at the bottom of the page, next to the signature line. It was an old seal, one she recognized not from corporate law, but from her abandoned dissertation on 19th-century industrial charters. She finished pouring the coffee. "Will there be anything else, Mr. Blackwood?" "No," Julian barked. "Leave, and do not come back." Amelia turned and walked toward the heavy oak door. Every survival instinct screamed at her to keep walking. Say nothing. She was a nobody. These men could ruin her, have her fired, ensure she never worked in this city again. She needed this job. Her father's debts were a mountain, and she was chipping away at it with a teaspoon. But then she glanced back. She saw Silas Blackwood, a giant of a man, looking so utterly broken, so completely alone. He reminded her of her father in his final days, staring out the hospital window, defeated by forces he couldn't control. Her heart hammered against her ribs. "Don't do it, Amelia. Just walk away." She stopped, her hand on the cold brass doorknob. She turned around. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice clear and resonant in the silent room. Silas looked up, his expression one of weary surprise. Julian slammed his palm on the table, making the silverware jump. "I said, 'Get out! Security!'" "Mr. Blackwood," Amelia repeated, her voice rising above Julian's tirade. "Before you sign that, you should ask your nephew why he's using a codicil to the founding charter of 1888 to execute a 21st century asset transfer." The room plunged into a silence so profound it seemed to suck the air from their lungs. This was not the silence of despair. It was the dead, electric quiet of a bomb that had just been discovered. Julian Croft's face, usually a mask of smug control, went slack. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving a sickly, grayish pallor. The mask didn't just slip, it shattered, revealing a flash of pure animal panic before he hastily reassembled his composure. "What in God's name are you talking about?" Julian stood, his chair scraping harshly against the parquet floor. He loomed over the table, a figure of manufactured outrage. "Who do you think you are? You're a waitress. You come in here, spouting gibberish, violating a dozen non-disclosure agreements." "I never signed an NDA, Amelia said, her voice trembling slightly, but her gaze unwavering. "I'm employed by the restaurant, not Blackwood Industries. And I know what I saw." Silas Blackwood slowly, deliberately, placed the cap back on his Mont Blanc pen. The click echoed in the room like a gavel. The fog of exhaustion in the old man's eyes was burning away, replaced by the sharp, calculating glint that had once terrified his competitors. For 50 years, he had navigated the treacherous waters of global business on gut instinct. And right now, his gut was screaming that the girl in the worn-out uniform was the only honest person in the room. "Sit down, Julian," Silas commanded. His voice was quiet, but it carried the intrinsic authority of a man who had signed paychecks for 50,000 people. "Uncle, this is absurd," Julian sputtered, gesturing wildly at Amelia. "She's delusional, probably trying to shake us down for money. This is a standard bankruptcy filing." "If it's standard," Silas said, his eyes now locked on Julian's, "then why are you sweating through a $7,000 suit?" He turned his heavy oak captain's chair to face Amelia. "Come here, child. What's your name?" "Amelia Vance, sir." "Amelia," Silas said, his voice softening. "You said this was a codicil to a charter from 1888. Explain what that means." Amelia took a hesitant step forward, the hostile glares of the lawyers feeling like physical blows. But she had crossed the Rubicon. There was no turning back. "The document you're about to sign, sir," she began, her voice gaining confidence as she stepped onto the familiar ground of her expertise. "It's not printed on modern legal bond paper. It's a linen rag composite, consistent with late 19th century archival documents. The watermark, I saw it in the reflection. It's the original Blackwood Forge and Foundry crest, and the embossed seal at the bottom isn't the current corporate seal. It's the original one from the company's founding charter. She took a deep breath, her mind racing, connecting disparate pieces of information she had absorbed over months of serving these men. You're not just signing a bankruptcy agreement. You're signing an amendment to the original founding legal document of your company, a document written under Illinois corporate law as it existed in 1888. Julian let out a cold, sharp laugh. Very impressive. You've been reading Wikipedia. So what? Our lawyers used the historical form for continuity. It's a symbolic gesture. It's not symbolic, Amelia countered, her eyes flashing. The 1888 Charter contains clauses that haven't been valid in corporate law for over a century, specifically the legacy proviso. Mr. Davies, the lead lawyer from Latham & Watkins, shifted uncomfortably. He cleared his throat. The legacy proviso is an archaic, unenforceable relic. It has no bearing. It has every bearing, Amelia interrupted, turning to the lawyer. The proviso states that in the event of insolvency, control of the company does not pass to creditors, but reverts to a trust managed by the lineal heir of the founder's bloodline for the purpose of preservation. It was designed to prevent hostile takeovers in the age of the robber barons. Under that clause, the company's assets wouldn't be sold to Ethelred Holdings. They would be transferred, free and clear, directly into a trust controlled by the sole remaining blood relative of your grandfather's brother. She turned and pointed a steady finger at Julian. A trust controlled by you. The silence that followed was a thunderclap. Silas stared at the document, then at his grandnephew, his face a mask of dawning horror. It's not a sale to an outside firm, Silas whispered, the pieces clicking into place. It's a theft. You manufactured this crisis to trigger an ancient clause that hands you the entire company. For nothing. Julian dropped the pretense. The charming nephew vanished, replaced by a cold-eyed predator. He smoothed his tie and sat back down, a venomous smirk returning to his lips. It's not theft, Uncle. It's a succession plan, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. You were too old and too sentimental to let go. You were running this company into the ground with your antiquated ideas of loyalty and lifetime employment. The market demands efficiency. I am saving the Blackwood legacy from your incompetence. By stealing it? Silas roared, slamming his fist on the table with a force that belied his age. That's fraud. That's a federal crime. Prove it, Julian challenged. The document is legally sound, if a bit creative. Our lawyers will argue it's a valid interpretation of the founding charter. By the time the courts figure it out, in 5 or 10 years, I will have already restructured, stripped the assets, and moved on. You, on the other hand, are still cornered. The clock is ticking. He glanced at the wall. It's 4:35 a.m. The wire authorization for the debt payment to our European creditors is set for 5 a.m. sharp. If you sign this document, the company is saved under my control and the wire is cancelled. If you don't sign, the payment defaults. The banks call in every loan, and the company is torn apart by a dozen different creditors by sunrise. You lose everything. The house, the pension, the name, everything. This waitress may have figured out my end game, but she hasn't changed the board. The checkmate is still yours. Silas sank back into his chair, the fight draining out of him. Julian was right. The financial trap was real. The debt was due. Even knowing the full extent of the betrayal, he was still trapped. He had no cash, no leverage, no time. The gun was still to his head. I have to sign, Silas murmured, his voice thick with defeat. He's right. If I don't, the banks will carve up the corpse anyway. No, Amelia said firmly. Every head in the room turned back to her. "Excuse me?" said Mr. Davies, the lawyer, his tone a mixture of disbelief and annoyance. "You don't have to sign," Amelia repeated, her mind working furiously, pulling together threads of conversations she'd overheard, snippets from financial reports left on tables she'd cleared. The legacy proviso. Julian is right that it gives him control in the event of insolvency, but he's either forgotten or ignored the second half of that clause. "And what would that be, Miss Waitress?" Julian sneered. Amelia walked to the head of the table, standing beside Silas. She looked directly at Julian. "It states that the transfer of control is contingent upon the unanimous consent of the acting board of directors, given freely and without duress. It was an old-fashioned check and balance. The family heir couldn't seize control without the approval of the trusted stewards of the company." Julian laughed. "The board? I control the board. I've spent the last year stacking it with my own people. The vote is a formality. They'll do what I say." "All but one," Amelia said quietly. "You don't have unanimous consent. You're missing a vote." "Who?" Julian snapped. "Everyone has already signed off on the restructuring." Amelia turned to Silas. "Mr. Blackwood, your wife, Eleanor. She held a board seat, didn't she? An honorary one, after she retired." A flicker of profound pain crossed Silas's face. "Eleanor passed away 2 years ago. Her seat has been vacant ever since." "No, sir," Amelia said gently. "It hasn't. I was cleaning out some old files in the records room last month, the ones being prepped for shredding. I found the minutes from the 2015 annual meeting. After Mrs. Blackwood stepped down from active participation, the board voted to make her seat a lifetime appointment, in perpetuity, to be passed to a designated successor of her choosing upon her death. Did she ever designate a successor?" Silas frowned, his mind delving back through a haze of grief. We talked about it once. She said she wanted it to go to someone who loved the company as much as she did. Someone with integrity. But she never filed the paperwork. She got sick so suddenly. "Are you sure?" Amelia pressed. "Did she write it down? In a letter? A personal directive? Under the 19th century bylaws that Julian is so fond of, a handwritten addendum to her will would be legally binding on the corporation." Silas's eyes went wide. He looked as if he'd been struck by lightning. "Her letters. She left a box of personal letters. With our estate lawyer. I was supposed to go through them, but I couldn't bring myself to—" Julian leapt to his feet. "This is a farce, a desperate, pathetic fantasy." "Get Howard on the phone," Silas barked at one of the stunned lawyers. "Howard Ginsberg, my personal attorney. Get him out of bed. Tell him to open the safe. Look for a blue Tiffany box. Find a letter addressed to the board." The room erupted into a controlled chaos. The corporate lawyer fumbled with his phone, his hands shaking. Julian was pacing like a caged panther, whispering furiously into his own phone, presumably to his allies on the board. Silas and Amelia stood together, a small island of calm in the storm. The grandfather clock in the corner of the room chimed the half-hour. "Funaha, 30 a.m. 30 minutes until the wire transfer deadline. The lawyer, Mr. Davies, finally connected with the elderly Howard Ginsberg, his voice a frantic squawk over the speakerphone. "Howard, it's Silas. I need you to— a blue box. Eleanor's letters." Ginsberg's sleepy, confused voice crackled back. "Silas? It's the middle of the night. What blue box?" "The one from her personal safe, Howard. The one with the letters for after she was gone." There was a pause, the sound of shuffling papers and a heavy sigh. "Ah, yes. I have it here, Silas. I was meant to give it to you at the 6-month mark. But, well, you know, I have the letter. It's addressed to the board of directors of Blackwood Industries." "Read it, Howard," Silas commanded. "Read it now." Julian froze, his phone call forgotten. Every person in the room held their breath. The old lawyer cleared his throat, and his voice, frail but clear, read the elegant, handwritten script of a woman long gone. To my esteemed colleagues, should this letter be read, it means I am gone. But my love for this company remains. In accordance with the rights granted to my lifetime board seat, I hereby designate my successor. This person embodies the integrity, grit, and heart that my husband built this company upon. I appoint, as my successor to the board of directors, a person who has shown more quiet dedication and love for the details of this company than any executive I have known. Ginsberg paused. It's an unusual choice, Silas. Who, Howard? Silas breathed. Who did she choose? There was a rustle of paper. I hereby designate Mrs. Maria Flores, the head of the janitorial staff at the corporate headquarters, to my seat on the board. For a full 10 seconds, the only sound was the rain. Julian Croft let out a strangled, incredulous laugh. Maria Flores? The cleaning lady? The one who barely speaks English? This is a joke. She speaks 5 languages, you arrogant prick, Silas growled, his eyes blazing. And she's worked for this company for 40 years. Eleanor adored her. She said Maria knew more about the heart of the company than anyone. He turned to the lawyer. Get her on the phone. Now. Finding Maria Flores at 4:40 a.m. was a frantic endeavor. She wasn't at home. Her daughter, reached after a dozen rings, said her mother had taken an extra night shift at the hospital where her grandson was recovering from an asthma attack. Another lawyer was dispatched in a town car, sirens unofficially blazing, to race to the west side. Meanwhile, Julian was regrouping. It doesn't matter, he sneered, regaining his composure. So you have your cleaning lady. I still have the rest of the board. I'll call an emergency vote. We'll vote her off the board before she can even vote on the transfer. You can't, Amelia said, her voice quiet but firm. She had found an old, leather-bound copy of the company's bylaws on a bookshelf in the dining room and was flipping through the fragile pages. Article 4, Section 3. A newly appointed board member, designated as a lifetime successor, cannot be removed without a cause of gross misconduct, and only after a probationary period of 90 days. Eleanor and your grandfather thought of everything. Julian's face was a thundercloud. He was trapped by the same archaic rules he had sought to exploit. The speakerphone crackled to life again. It was the lawyer who had been sent to the hospital. I have her. She's confused, Mr. Blackwood. But she's here. Maria, Silas said, his voice thick with emotion. Maria, it's Silas Blackwood. I am in terrible trouble, and I need your help. A heavily accented, hesitant voice came through the phone. Mr. Silas, is everything okay? No, Maria, it is not, Silas said. Julian is trying to steal the company. He is using a legal trick. He needs a unanimous board vote to make it happen. You are on the board now. Eleanor appointed you. There was a stunned silence from the other end. Maria, Silas pleaded, they need your vote to approve a motion. The motion is to transfer control of the company to Julian. I am asking you to vote no. Julian lunged for the phone. Mrs. Flores, this is Julian Croft. Mr. Blackwood is unwell. He's confused. The company. The final chime of the clock faded into a silence more profound than any that had preceded it. It was the silence of a vacuum, the stillness that follows a detonation, where the air itself seems to hold its breath. The storm outside had broken, but inside the Gilded Steer, a new, unsettling weather system was forming. The first rays of a bruised grey dawn seeped through the plate glass window, illuminating the carnage of the night. It was the light of a battlefield, catching the glint of shattered glass from Julian's phone, the waxy pallor of the lawyers' faces, the dark pools of coffee spilled on a document that had nearly unwritten a century of history. Julian Croft did not move. He stood as a statue of his own ruin, his bespoke suit suddenly looking like a cheap costume. The smugness, the predatory confidence, had been flayed from him, leaving behind something hollow and shockingly young. He stared at Amelia, and in his eyes was not just hatred but a terrifying, bottomless bewilderment. He was a man who had calculated every variable, manipulated every asset, and anticipated every move, only to be undone by an unknown quantity, a paleographer who saw history where he saw only text. Silas Blackwood rose, his movement slow, the creak of his joints audible in the stillness. He was not the reborn titan the moment might have suggested. The adrenaline of the fight had ebbed, leaving behind the deep, aching weariness of a 79-year-old man who had just stared into the abyss. He looked at his grandnephew, the boy he had once bounced on his knee, and felt not the fire of righteous anger, but a cold, desolate sorrow. "Get him out of my sight," Silas said, his voice a low rumble of gravel. It was not a command. It was a dismissal. The security guards, who had materialized at the door as if summoned by the shift in barometric pressure, stepped forward. Julian offered no resistance. As they led him past the table, his vacant gaze fell upon the linen rag codicil, the beautiful, archaic trap he had set for his uncle, which had instead snapped shut on him. His own cleverness had become his cage. He didn't look at Amelia as he passed. He didn't seem capable of looking at anyone. He was already a ghost, haunting the space between his ambition and his reality. When the heavy oak door clicked shut behind him, the tension in the room did not dissipate. It curdled. The two lawyers from Latham and Watkins, who had been predators circling a kill hours earlier, now looked like cornered animals. Their professional masks had melted, revealing the raw panic of men who had just witnessed their billable hours transform into potential evidence. Mr. Davies opened his mouth, a string of legalese and disavowals already forming on his lips. "Save it," Silas rasped, holding up a hand. "I'll be speaking with your firm's managing partner at 9 a.m. Until then, you will not touch a single document on this table. You will not wipe your phones. You will sit there and contemplate the concept of accessory to federal fraud." He turned his gaze, heavy with the weight of the night, to Amelia. "You and I, young lady, are leaving." He walked to her, his gait unsteady, and took the heavy Brioni jacket he had draped over her shoulders earlier. He didn't put it back on. Instead, he folded it carefully, as if it were a flag from a fallen country. The gesture was one of finality. He was no longer the man who wore that armor. The walk through the deserted restaurant was surreal. The Gilded Steer, usually a pantheon of power and influence, was now just a cold, empty room that smelled of stale cigar smoke and desperation. Amelia felt a tremor run through her, the delayed shock of the night's events finally breaching her defenses. The world outside the restaurant doors was washed in the thin, watery light of a Chicago dawn. The city was waking up, its arteries beginning to pulse with the traffic of 1,000,000 lives, all blissfully unaware of the dynastic war that had been fought and won in a private dining room. Silas's driver, a stoic man named Frank, who had been with him for 30 years, pulled the black Maybach to the curb. He took one look at his employer's face and said nothing, his silence a testament to decades of loyal discretion. They slid into the buttery leather of the back seat. The car moved off, a silent black vessel navigating the still sleeping streets. For 10 minutes, neither spoke. Silas stared out the window, his reflection a ghostly superimposition over the awakening city. He was watching the monolithic steel and glass towers glide by, buildings that housed the very banks and hedge funds that had been ready to pick his company's bones clean. "He was my sister's grandson," Silas said finally, his voice so quiet Amelia had to lean closer to hear. "I paid for his education, Wharton, gave him his first job, trusted him. I saw the ambition, of course. I thought it was the Blackwood fire, the hunger that built this company. I never realized it was the kind of fire that consumes everything it touches." Amelia remained silent, sensing that he was not speaking to her, but to the ghosts in the car with them. The ghost of his wife, Eleanor, the ghost of his own judgment, the ghost of the man he had been the day before. "You have a choice to make, Amelia," he said, turning from the window to face her. His eyes, sunken in bruised hollows of exhaustion, were terrifyingly clear. "You can take the check I am going to write for you, a sum large enough to erase your father's debts, fund your education, and ensure you never have to work another 60-hour week in your life. And you can walk away. Disappear. Go back to your medieval manuscripts. No one would blame you. Or you can come to work with me." "Doing what?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Surviving," he said, a flicker of the old steel returning to his voice. "Julian wasn't wrong about everything. The company is bleeding. The vulnerabilities he exploited are not fictions. The debt is real. The board is compromised. The wolves are not gone. They've just retreated to the edge of the woods, waiting. What happened in that room was not a victory. It was a stay of execution. I am old, Amelia. I am tired. My instincts are from another era. I need your eyes. I need the way you see the patterns hidden in the paper." He was not offering her a job as a reward. He was asking for help. He was a king whose castle was crumbling, extending a hand to the commoner who had spotted the rot in the foundation. "I'm a doctoral dropout with a specialization in 14th century monastic scriptoriums," she said, the absurdity of it all washing over her. "I don't know the first thing about corporate governance or leveraged buyouts." "Good," Silas grunted. "Then you haven't been taught the wrong things yet." Julian knew everything about corporate governance. He knew all the rules. That's why he thought he could break them. You know about history. You know about integrity. You know that the words on the page matter. That's a better starting point than any MBA. The car pulled up to the Blackwood Tower, a severe, imposing structure of black granite and smoked glass that seemed to challenge the rising sun. The battle was over. The war was about to begin. "I'll need coffee," Amelia said, her voice barely a whisper. "And access to the company archives. All of them. Going back to 1888. A slow, weary smile touched Silas Blackwood's lips for the first time that day. "Frank," he said into the intercom, "take Miss Vance's coat. She'll be with us for a while." The first 100 days were a crucible. Amelia's official title was a deliberately vague special advisor to the chairman, a position that granted her access to everything and authority over nothing. It was a title designed to infuriate the existing power structure, and it succeeded spectacularly. The board members Julian had installed treated her with a venomous contempt, referring to her in hushed but audible tones as the coffee girl or Silas's pet historian. Her first board meeting was a public execution. They buried her in acronyms, EBITDA, CAPEX, LBOs, and peppered her with questions about derivative hedging strategies and quarterly growth projections. She sat in silence, her face pale, meticulously taking notes in a simple spiral notebook as the wolves circled. She didn't try to answer. She just listened. Her only ally was Maria Flores, who had attended the meeting in her crispest janitorial uniform, a silent, powerful rebuke to the room's bespoke arrogance. When one of the board members, a hedge fund manager named Sterling, sneered, "Does Ms. Vance have an opinion, or is she just here to take minutes?" It was Maria who spoke up. Her English was heavily accented, but her meaning was perfectly clear. "She is listening," Maria said, her gaze sweeping across the hostile faces. "Something none of you have done for a long time. You listen only to the numbers. You do not listen to the people who make them." The room fell silent, stunned by the simple truth of it. After the meeting, Amelia retreated not to a corner office, but to the sub-basement archives, a cavernous, climate-controlled vault filled with a century of paper. It was her sanctuary, her native environment. While Silas fought the political battles upstairs, holding off the banks with sheer force of will and promises he wasn't sure he could keep, Amelia began to read. She read board minutes from the 1920s, land deeds from the Great Depression, engineering specifications from World War II, and labor contracts from the 1970s. She wasn't looking for a single silver bullet. She was mapping the company's soul. She discovered that Blackwood Industries wasn't just a corporation. It was a complex ecosystem of obligations, promises, and forgotten assets. She found that the company owned thousands of acres of timberland in the Pacific Northwest, purchased in the 1930s, and written off the books for decades. She found a portfolio of patents for metallurgical processes, filed in the 1960s and deemed obsolete, that described alloys remarkably similar to those now in high demand for battery technology. She found that the company's pension fund, which Julian had claimed was hopelessly underfunded, was tied to real estate holdings whose value had been deliberately and systematically underestimated for years by a CFO loyal to him. She worked 18-hour days, fueled by cafeteria coffee and a cold, burning rage. She was not just fighting for Silas. She was fighting for her late father, a man who had been crushed by a system of impenetrable fine print and financial jargon. Every ledger she deciphered, every hidden asset she uncovered, was a small victory against the forces that had defeated him. Her relationship with Silas deepened, evolving beyond that of employer and employee. They fell into a routine. Every evening, at 8 p.m., she would go to his vast, silent office on the top floor. He would be there, slumped in his chair, looking out at the glittering expanse of Chicago. She would lay out her findings on his great mahogany desk, not spreadsheets and PowerPoint decks, but copies of old maps, faded blueprints, and handwritten letters. He would tell her the stories behind them. "That parcel of land," he'd say, pointing to a map of Oregon. "My father bought that for a song from a logging company going under in '38. Said a man should always own the land his resources come from." Or, "This alloy. We developed it for the turbine blades on the B-52 bomber. The government cancelled the contract. We mothballed the research. Never thought it would be worth a damn." He was giving her the company's oral history, its institutional memory. She, in turn, was giving him a new lens through which to view it. She was connecting the dots of his own past in ways he never had, showing him that the value of his company was not in its quarterly earnings, but in its accumulated history. The very things Julian had derided as nostalgia, the old foundry, the long-term employees, the commitment to American manufacturing, were, she argued, their greatest untapped assets. The turning point came during a brutal negotiation with a consortium of banks. The bankers, led by a slick, condescending man from Goldman Sachs, had them cornered. They were demanding a controlling interest in the company in exchange for restructuring the debt. They saw Silas as a dinosaur and Amelia as an irrelevant curiosity. "The numbers don't lie, Silas," the banker said smugly. "Your tangible assets don't cover your liabilities. We're being generous." Amelia, who had been silent for the entire meeting, cleared her throat. "Your assessment of our tangible assets appears to be based on the 2018 appraisal, which we have recently discovered was commissioned by a firm with significant ties to Julian Croft's private equity interests." She slid a thick file across the table. "This is a new, independent geological survey and timber assessment of our land holdings in the Pacific Northwest, which your analysts have valued at $30 million. The current market value of the timber alone is closer to $400 million. Furthermore, you seem to have overlooked our patent portfolio for specialized cobalt-chromium alloys. A small technology firm in California has offered us $80 million for a licensing agreement on a single one of those patents. We have 17, she continued, her voice calm and steady, as she dismantled their entire valuation model piece by piece. She spoke of mineral rights, of cellular tower leases on their properties, of the carbon credits attached to their timberland. The banker's smug expressions slowly dissolved, replaced by a mixture of shock and grudging respect. By the end of the meeting, they were no longer demanding control. They were asking to be partners in the company's revitalization. That night, Silas didn't wait for Amelia in his office. He met her in the archives. The air was cool and smelled of old paper and time. He didn't say a word. He simply walked over to a framed document on the wall, the original 1888 charter of the Blackwood Forge and Foundry. He took it down and, with a small key from his pocket, opened the back. Tucked inside was a single, folded sheet of paper. It was a letter from his grandfather, the founder. "He wrote this to my father when he handed over the company," Silas said, his voice thick with emotion. "Read it." The handwriting was a fierce, angular script. "Son," it read, "never forget that we do not make steel. We make things that last. Our name is on every beam and every gear, and a man's name is all he truly owns. Do not trust the men who sell numbers on a page. Trust the men who get their hands dirty. Trust the history of the metal. It does not lie." Silas looked at Amelia, his old eyes shining with unshed tears. "My grandfather would have liked you," he said. "You get your hands dirty. You trust the history." A year after that night in the Gilded Steer, Blackwood Industries was a different company. It was leaner, but not because it had fired its people. It was leaner because it had shed the parasitic financial structures Julian had built. It was stronger because it had rediscovered its roots. The old foundry, once slated for closure, was now the heart of their new advanced materials division, manufacturing components for aerospace and medical technology. Maria Flores was the head of a new board committee on employee relations, and her practical wisdom had proven more valuable than a dozen management consultants. The stock price had not tripled. It had stabilized, and then begun a slow, steady climb built on real-world results, not market speculation. It was a recovery as solid and unglamorous as the steel they forged. One evening, Amelia stood with Silas on the observation deck of the Blackwood Tower, the city lights spread out below them like a field of fallen stars. "The board has formally accepted my retirement," Silas said quietly. "The vote for my successor was unanimous." Amelia looked out at the city, her city now, in a way she could never have imagined. She thought of the frantic, terrified waitress she had been, a ghost haunting the edges of other people's lives. She thought of her father, and a pang of sorrow, sharp and familiar, pierced her. She wished he could see her now. "Are you ready, Amelia?" Silas asked. She turned to him. In her hand she was holding a small, heavy object. It was an old gear from the original foundry, salvaged during the renovation. She ran her thumb over its worn teeth. It was a piece of history, solid and real. "Credentials get your foot in the door," she said, echoing his words from that first morning. "Character is what lets you stay in the room." She met his gaze, her own eyes clear and steady. "I think I'm ready to stay in the room." He nodded, a deep and abiding pride on his face. He was leaving his legacy not to a man of his blood, but to a woman of his principles. Later that night, long after Silas had gone home, Amelia walked the empty executive floor alone. She passed the grand, formal boardroom and the executive dining room. Through the service door, she could see a young man clearing away the last of the dinner service. He had a textbook tucked into his bag, its title just visible: Introduction to Contract Law. He looked up and saw her, the new CEO, and his eyes widened in a mixture of awe and fear. Amelia smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached her eyes. She didn't offer him a card or a scholarship. The systems for that were already in place now, woven into the fabric of the company. Instead, she just looked at him, seeing not a waiter, but a person with a story and a struggle she understood intimately. "Have a good night," she said softly. "Get some rest. Tomorrow is a new day." She walked to the window of her new office and looked down. The city was a vast, intricate text, a living document of 1,000,000 interconnected lives. She had learned to read its history, its hidden clauses, its fine print. And now she picked up her pen. It was her turn to write the next chapter.